disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday's June 21 issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. President Trump lost this war. The preliminary deal ending President Trump's 4-month war with Iran is welcome, but brings it with hard truths. Mr. Trump made a terrible mistake starting this war. He prosecuted recklessly and in open defiance of the law. The United States is emerging weaker, militarily, diplomatically, economically, and will pay strategic cost for years to come. Many details remain unclear, but the announced deal suggests that Mr. Trump has won few of the terms he insisted that he would. It is a humiliating come down for him and the nation he leads. Since the war began, he has said the United States would achieve total, complete victory, and that Iran must agree to unconditional surrender. He suggested that regime change would occur. He said that Iran would be permitted no enrichment of uranium, and that the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove all of the deeply buried new bomb-grade nuclear material that it already holds. None of this appears to be true. Iran's hardline government remains in place. The specifics of the nuclear agreement will apparently be negotiated over the next 2 months, but the terms seem likely to resemble those of a 2015 deal that President Obama negotiated and that Mr. Trump canceled in 2018. He described the Obama agreement as the worst deal ever and said it put Iran on a route to nuclear weapon. He criticized it for failing to force Iran to stop supporting terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and for loosening economic sanctions. Yet, his destructive war seems likely to leave him with a similar deal. His biggest achievement in the ceasefire framework is the expected reopening of the Strait of Hormuz in global shipping traffic, which will eventually reduce the price of energy and other goods. That, of course, is merely a reversion to the pre-war status quo. Iran closed the strait in retaliation to damage the global economy and increase political pressure on the U.S. The move worked, and Iran's leaders now understand they hold a powerful economic weapon. On balance, Iran emerges the strategic winner of the 4-month war. It did suffer substantial loss, including much of its Navy, Air Force, military industrial capacity, and political leadership, including Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who was killed on the war's first day. With the war ending, however, Iran's leadership can begin rebuilding. The United States, for its part, looks weaker in the eyes of the world. The American military has shown itself unable to quash a much smaller opponent, even as it burned through many of its long-range precision missiles and interceptors. The outcome damages this country's ability to deter other potential adversaries. To begin to repair the damage, the United States would be wise to mend alliances in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. that have been frayed by the war's military and economic effects. The Pentagon will also need to modernize and prepare for the wars of the future. Neither is likely to happen under President Trump. Before the Americans and Israeli attack began on February 28th, Iran's leadership had endured a miserable 2.5 years. The government was far weaker than it had been before October 7th, 2023, attack on Israel by Hamas, which Iran has long funded and advised. In response to that attack, Israel significantly diminished Hamas and Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy group. In Syria, a murderous Iran-backed dictator fell while Iran's leader did little to save him. Israel and the United States exposed Iran's air defense and missile program as paper tigers, and then they bombed Iranian nuclear sites last summer, setting back its program. All the while, Iran's currency continued to plummet, and the economy was in ruins. Starting late last year, Iranians took to the streets to protest, and the regime responded by killing thousands of them, if not tens of thousands. All these problems remain, and Iran is still weaker than it was 3 years ago. But the war has given it leverage it did not have when 2026 began. Its regime has demonstrated that it can survive waves of attacks from its two biggest enemies. Its leaders have not had to abandon their nuclear ambitions, and they have learned that the rest of the world seems unwilling to use military force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran chooses to close the strait at some point in the coming months or years, what will Mr. Trump do in response? We lay out these facts with no pleasure. Iran has been and remains a force for ill. It represses its own people, especially political dissidents, women, LGBTQ people, and religious minorities. It is a world leader in torture and executions, and it has financed terrorism in its region and far beyond. Iran's leaders have impoverished a country. Per capita income was above the global average as recently as the 1970s. The regime's distinct brutality should have been reason for the United States to think carefully and plan cautiously for any war. The history of modern American wars, particularly in Iran's region, is full of hubris and incubated defeat, yet Mr. Trump eschewed thoughtful planning at every step. He accepted the rose-colored assessment of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who predicted that the Iranian regime would quickly fall. Mr. Trump dismissed the views of his aides who told him that Mr. Netanyahu's forecast was farcical. Mr. Trump ignored the Constitution and refused to seek congressional approval for the war. He did not listen to European and Asian allies who opposed the war. He failed to plan for Iran's obvious ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. He made threats about destroying Iranian civilization that succeeded only in diminishing America's moral standing. For this sins, he has now agreed to a peace deal that the entire world understands is a defeat for him. It is a setback for America also. Tehran Defied the West on One by Azadeh Movani is an opinion writer and associate professor of journalism at NYU. On October 22, 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of Israel stood before the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Addressing a crowd of hundreds in Indian Hall, Mr. Mossadegh spoke admirably of American liberty, drawing parallels between the U.S. struggle for independence and Iran's then continuing struggle to break free of British control over its affairs and national resources. The creed of national independence is a universal one and is held by all peoples, he declared in his morose trademark whisper. 2 years later, the U.S. and Britain disposed the Iranian prime minister in a coup over his decision to nationalize Iranian oil and take control of the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. As large portions of the world embraced new national identities in the wake of colonialism, Mr. Mossadegh's name became synonymous with the quest for independence and the fight against Western imperialism. His ouster is still bitterly invoked across the global South to conjure the misadventures of American foreign policy. Today, Iran's defiance in the face of Western coercion has once again become a rallying cry. President Trump's feckless war has rendered America's targeting Iran into a pre-monetary tale, a violent punishment that could befall any disorderly state. This spring's solidarity, support, and indignation on behalf of Iran have reverberated across all the Western world. Even countries that do not at all admire the Iranian's regime, treatment of people, or its conduct in the region are experiencing a Je suis Iran moment. Listener, it's French. Je suis means I am. This sense of outrage is due to no small part to the fact that the U.S. and Israel went to war against Iran as the world was again reordering itself, this time to adapt to Mr. Trump's transactional and predatory behavior. Small and middle powers are thinking about ways to assert their sovereignty, in some cases by reducing their dependence on the U.S. and cultivating trade and relations with China and other powers. The war against Iran rapidly became an inflection point in the trajectory. Not only has Iran shown that it can control a major maritime checkpoint, squeeze the global economy, and withstand aerial assault by the world's strongest military, the conflict also has offered its leaders a new place in the emerging global realignment. From the blackest margins of the old order, isolated, sanctioned, ignored, and reviled as a ruthless representative state, Iran has become, in the eyes of many, an example of necessary defiance and courage. The disposal of Mr. Mossadegh in 1953 left Iran traumatized, and its people sharply wary of Washington designs. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi never recovered from the legitimacy he lost by cooperating with America, and doubt about his true independence coalesced into the 1979 revolution. After that, the tensions became the new Islamic Republic, and America turned to violent enmity. The language of political confrontation between the nations transformed from the courtly phrases of the early Mossadegh era to the new leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, describing America as the great Satan, the wounded snake, number one enemy of the deprived and oppressed people of the world. American rhetoric deteriorated as well. President Ronald Reagan referred to Iran's leaders, along with the rulers of Cuba, Libya, North Korea, and Nicaragua, as misfits, Looney Tunes, squalid criminals. By the late 2000s, John McCain and Hillary Clinton made casual, violent threats to bomb Iran, normal foreign policy talk. Ayatollah al-Khamenei, successor as supreme leader, kept up the same course, fulminating tones till assassination as American-Israeli strike in February 28. 11 days before his death, Khomeini, 80, called the United States an empire that is heading towards collapse. When Iran's newest group of leaders took out, they must have this narrative echoing across the world. While China and Russia's interests in the Middle East are vastly different, Beijing has extensive economic interest in the region. This favors high oil prices, neither of which is true for Moscow. Both benefit when America overextends itself, and they have cast themselves as major powers ready to expand ties in the regional blocs that have suffered from disapproval of the war. When China's President Xi Jinping hosted the Russian counterpart, Putin, in Beijing last month, the two leaders condemned treacherous U.S. strikes against other countries. And Mr. Xi warned against the word regressing to the law of the jungle, while Beijing prudently preferred to condemn the war rather than openly back Iran. It found a subtle way to express its support. In March, a highly unusual move, the Chinese state broadcast put out an artificial intelligent voice featuring America's the villainous white eagle, and Iran is the hunted but proud Persian cat. The video became a crossover hit on Western social platforms. Some smaller countries have been more explicit. In March, the Malaysian parliament observed a minute of silence over the killing of Khomeini, other immigrant leaders, and an airstrike on a school in Mina, apparently killing 120 children. And Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim sent condolences to both the regime and the Iranian people and warned of a dangerous precedent that would weaken the norms of international order. In Pakistan, the editorial pages of the leading English newspaper, Dawn, concluded that the countries of the global south should stand with Iran and condemn the war because they may be next. Pro-Iran demonstrations erupted across the nation in March, leaving more than 20 people dead. In Turkey, an overwhelming Sunni Muslim country, 93% of the people polled opposed the attack of Iran, and President Recep Erdogan warned that the senseless, unlawful war was starting to weaken Europe. In India, while the government of Modi has professed itself a close ally of Israel, the people who share a historical and cultural affinity with Iran responded differently. Residents of New Delhi, including Hindu nationalist supporters of Mr. Modi, brought enough donations to the door of the Iranian embassy to fund a shipment of medication. In Kashmir, farmers donated their sheep and women donated their gold bangles and daughters' trousseau in an aid collection drive. In other parts of the world, we quickly kicked up long simmering concerns about sovereignty. In Africa, economy-seeking movements are already driving politics in West Africa, and the Sahel seeking to reduce dependence on Europe, donors, and send partnerships with its militaries. Those movements now look prescient, as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has exacted a brutal price across the continent. The war in Iran is a warning, wrote Faiz Jacobs, a former South African lawmaker, arguing that the war now arrives in households through petrol prices, electricity insecurity, bread costs, job losses. His argument, echoed widely in the continent press, is that Africa must detach from systems designed elsewhere and controlled elsewhere and turn to the Common and BRICS cooperative and everything from payment alternatives to industrial corridors to maritime strategies. There are exceptions, of course, especially among countries that are deeply polarized along religious lines, or though that have been strong ties to Israel and Persian Gulf states. Many governments have chosen to simply say nothing, in some cases perhaps out of concern of what Mr. Trump will turn his attention next. In Cuba, people have followed the conflict avidly during the short hours of the day when they have electricity, the historian Sari Kozan told me. For Cubans, it matters whether Iran wins, since the defeat of the United States could reduce the likelihood of an attack on Cuba. But they also understand that Trump needs to feel like he got a win so that he doesn't attack Cuba to get one. Iran has played a role of iconoclastic challenges to an unjust world before. In the wake of decolonization, it was the first Middle Eastern oil-producing country to attempt the nationalization of its oil sector. When Prime Minister Mossadegh stopped in Egypt in 1951, 250,000 people reportedly lined the streets of Cairo, many of them chanting, "Long live the leader of anti-imperialism." Then came the coup. Mr. Mossadegh failed, but his audacity helped usher in a new world order. An inspired Egyptian president, Gamal Nasser, closely studied his approach and missteps and triumphantly nationalized the Suez Canal 3 years after Mr. Mossadegh was overthrown. Today, there are no great crowds cheering an adversary of empire. We have instead an online public sphere that Iran's propagandists have flooded with Lego videos to make its case at the world's young people. Some people claim Iran's winning the vibe war. It is mostly bookish elites who remember the 1950s and the earlier round of Iran versus empire. Does tonight resemble the last night? Asked the veteran Egyptian diplomat Walid Abdel Nasser in the newspaper Al Abram, recalling Mr. Mossadegh's visit to Cairo and suggesting the time around it will be a military attack, not a stealthy coup, but word come in Iran's oil wealth. In fact, the government of Washington and Tel Aviv contemplated a mini regime change with a plot to install the former president Mohammed Ahmadinejad. What unites disparate small and medium countries in parsing the lesson of the war is the belief that they are standing in shaky ground. They know now with certainty that if they did not know before, that their own wealth and economics are imperiled by the new Washington, unbound by the international guardrails established last century, and they will spend the years ahead repositioning themselves. The world will seek new ground to stand on as friends and foes adjust. Some doubt that Iran's successful defiance of the U.S. will diminish America's influence. America's military defeat after it's nothing new. Most of America's military interventions since World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, have ended as meandering, low-level conflicts that few would call victory. Policy expert Gideon Rose used loose talk about the war signaling a broader loss of U.S. power. As overblown, after losing in Vietnam, he recently wrote, America's rebounded and could very likely do it again. Perhaps it is Iran's fate to find itself again for the second time in a century, subject of American aggression and the rebel protagonism of the non-Western world. Its millenniums of history as a nation have made the preservation of sovereignty the goal of Iran's all-consuming drive, regardless of who runs it. Where for the long meanwhile does the disordered story leave Iranian themselves? For them, matters are far more complicated. The wave of solidarity and sympathy comes not long after the regime has lost much of its legitimacy in the eyes of its own population, only a few short weeks after it killed thousands of protesters. The war cut short that period of mourning to spare the global condemnation. Instead, Mr. Trump and Israel appear to have shored up and consolidated the Iranian state, raising its profile as a symbol of clever defiance and softening views of many inside the country who hated and opposed it because they recognized that it defended them through weeks of terrifying bombardment. The Islamic public is not accustomed to perceiving itself as a part of a larger whole, and is far from certain how long this surge in goodwill can last. But Iran now has a story to tell, and it has the ability to tell it. Huh. The Biden verdict is in, and it isn't pretty. The former president and first lady rage against the dying of the spotlight. No matter how desperately Democrats may want to move beyond them or just forget about them altogether, Bidens keep popping up. Jill has a memoir out, View from the East Wing, and Joe is working on one too. Hunter emotes all over social media, and the Democratic National Committee has grudgingly released a report blaming Kamala Harris' 2024 defeat in part on her reluctance to break with the role boss. On the final page of her book, Joe makes plain that the Bidens are determined to stick around. As Dylan Thomas wrote, we will not go gently that good night, but rage against the dying of the light. Nothing like quoting from a poem about defiance in the face of the age and mortality to remind people of what went wrong with Joseph R. Biden. Maybe they're hanging around because they feel they never got their due. The Biden presidency was an odd one, overshadowed by the man who would be both its predecessor and its successor. During the 4 years that Biden lived in the White House, we all still lived in the so-called Trump era. Joe, whose eternal quest for the White House had a whiff of obsessiveness, never even gotten raucous balloon-dropping conventions, first because of COVID, and then because he was out. Now, almost exactly 2 years removed from the debate night that ended Joe Biden's political career, can his presidency be judged on its own merits? Or did the matter mainly because he denied Donald Trump's second term and then handed him one? In the presidency of Joseph Biden, a first historical assessment, a collection of historians and social scientists, led by Julian Zeltzer of Princeton, take on an early cut in the judging draw blood. The administration was an ominous interregnum, writes one. Biden was better suited for a time gone by, offers another. His presidency ended somewhat between tragedy and farce, concludes one more. The book is the latest in the Princeton University's press-passing judgment on recently departed U.S. presidents. Similar volumes on Trump, Barack Obama, and Bush, and its chapters methodically review the Biden administration's records on policy and politics, the battles with the Supreme Court, the efforts to prosecute January 6th rioters, Biden's equity agenda in education and racial justice, the failings of the Bidenomics in the pandemic crisis, the fight over transgender rights, which the president called civil rights issues of our time, and border security, the challenge posed by China and Russia, and the two failed withdrawals, one from Afghanistan, the other from the 2024 race. Taken together, historians' assessment point in a reoccurring challenge for Biden. His substantive defeat at times offered temporary political advantages, but his major successes failed to deliver sustained political benefits, and that is how you become a one-term president. Consider the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in Dobbs versus Jackson, which ended constitutional right to abortion. Initial outrage against the ruling gave Biden and Democrats a potential political lifetime. Even Harris, who became the administration's top post-Dobbs proponent of abortion rights, could not adequately articulate, either as vice president or as the last second minute, what she would do against the matter, other than run on it. In a sense, Dobbs defeated the Democrats twice over. Not only did it undermine abortion rights, but improving the party's midterm performance. It also reaffirmed the belief among Biden and his advisors that he had enough support in the public and in the party to seek re-election. We know how that turned out. Persistent inflation and permissive border policy became dead weight on the Democrats' 2024 prospects. But even Biden's signature accomplishment failed to deliver much political gain. Biden defied cynics as he pushed through a massive legislative agenda through his first 2 years. Politicians' constant compulsion to blame and gap policy victories and political support simply are poor communications, or worse, poor messaging, is a bit too pat, both self-serving and self-exonerating. If only they knew about all the great things I've done. But Biden, who by late in his term had become among the most inaccessible presidents in modern history, Timothy, the tale of Columbus, writes, did himself a few favors on the front. He did not just fail to tout his achievements, he seldom even tried. Michael Castan, a historian at Georgetown, complains, on education policy, Biden's lack of a declarative, coherent message largely ceded to his opponents the upper hand in defining his educational legacy. Biden should have framed his vision more decisively and enthusiastically, he argues, as well as better counterattacks from the right, and accused him of left-wing ideological capture, of supporting curricular change that focused on identity, inequality, and grievance. It's hard to deflect such attacks, however, when they're not entirely off the mark. As Melhem Petzetzel writes a few pages later, the most defining aspect of Biden's administration is ideological, the embrace of equity as a guiding principle. Princeton University's Khalil Gibran Muhammad hails Biden as America's first equity president and seems to wish that the president had made that case with greater frequency and greater force. In her memoir, Jo reimagines her husband's communication struggles as something between a mistake and a virtue. While Joe was in office, I think he and I both erred on the side of silence, dignity, and letting news cycles run their course, she explains. Now she wonders if she should have engaged with news cycles more aggressively, especially right after the president's Hindenburg-level disaster of a debate against Trump in June of 2024. We were trying so hard to reassure everyone that we didn't take the time to acknowledge that he looked very unwell in that debate to say to the public, yes, that was bad, no doubt. Biden's struggles with communication surely flowed in part from his age. Read original sin by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson to see how his staff shielded him from the public as his condition deteriorated. But they may often reflect that he was an imperfect vessel for the position he felt compelled to take. The cradle Catholic ambivalently supporting abortion rights. The author of the 1994 crime bill is a champion of racial justice. The Democrat who won the nomination precisely because he was perceived more centrist and moderate. The not Bernie candidate who could beat Trump while pledging to deliver one of the most progressive administrations in American history. Is it that Biden communicated poorly or that he didn't quite believe in himself? The one arena where Biden seemed most devoted to a particular cause, more faithful to a long-held belief, was the one that would split his party on generational and ideological grounds. His dedicated backing of Israel after the brutal Hamas attack, whatever credibility the administration gained from its unwavering support of Israel, was lost when Biden declined to exercise enough leverage to change Israel's actions that caused so many civilian casualties. Writes Daniel Kurtz, a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and Israel, and now a scholar at Princeton. The unpopularity of the Biden administration, including its record on inflation in the sense that it was, let's say, less than forthcoming on the president's true condition, is reason enough that any former official from Team Biden may struggle to win the Democratic nomination in 2028. But to the extent that foreign policy plays a role, Israel and Gaza may prove a crucial dividing line as well. Even Jill Biden stakes out her territory, writing in her memoir about the post notes she left for the president on a bathroom mirror, warning him about President Netanyahu of Israel. Net has to stop, the First Lady wrote. And another, don't let BN use your goodness. As I look back to the presidency, I seem clear that Biden's most persistent pitch was not about foreign policy or even about specific domestic legislation. It's much about a certain feeling about America. Biden wanted to save the nation's soul, he told us repeatedly, which to him basically meant saving it from Trump. The videos that kicked off Biden's campaign for 2020 were all about Trump. The first focused on Charlottesville, the second on January 6th. Biden was an unlikely person to be put in charge of carrying out the grandiose mission of saving the nation's soul. The 46th president was never a particularly strong orator, especially as he aged, and he had not yet articulated a distinction vision of national identity and purpose. During the 2020 campaign, even Biden's own pollster couldn't make sense of "no one knows what this whole America stuff means," he said, using an explicative. In view from the East Wing, Joe Biden tries to clarify the Bidens resolved to create a new beginning for the country after 4 years of toxic politics, she writes. They hoped Americans would remember how good unity felt, and she asserts that the country was a kinder place with her husband in the West Wing. Even if you accept this platitudinous mission statement, that new beginning barely got started. The good memories remain distant, and a kinder America feels ever more remote. The soul of America, if Trump were the measure, had not been saved. Zellner writes of the Democratic loss. Biden had failed to fulfill his fundamental promise. But failure does not always mean departure. As Dylan Thomas wrote, wise men know the dark is right, yet the Bidens still rage against the dying of the spotlight. Editorial comment, regardless if you're to the right or to the left, maybe Biden failed, but it seemed that Biden was a good moral man as opposed to what's going on now. In Britain, the far right is setting the agenda. Hostility to immigrants has become a fixture of British politics. In Britain, the far right is setting the agenda. Mobs of masked men tore through parts of Belfast, Northern Ireland, early this month, setting fire to cars and homes. Their primary targets are people of color. And the prompt was a knife attack for which the authorities charge a Sudanese refugee. Graphic video of the attack was shared on social media. About a week earlier, riots had followed the release of body cameras footage of the December murder of Henry Nowak, 18-year-old student at Southampton, a city in southern England. The video showed that the police handcuffed Mr. Nowak as he lay dying there, being stabbed by a British-born Sikh who lied to officers at the scene, falsely claiming that Mr. Nowak had carried out a racially motivated attack. These events had echoes of previous summers. In 2025, mobs targeted the homes of immigrants and a recreation center that was being used as an emergency shelter in Ballymena, Northern Ireland, after two teenagers were accused of attempted rape. The teenagers denied the charge and spoke through Romanian interpreters. The charges were later dropped. 2024, a horrific knife attack on a dance class for children in Southport was quickly framed as a consequence of British openness to asylum seekers, even though the assailant was born in Wales. Episodes like these punctuate the British calendar with grim familiarity, following a template as troubling for the direction of the British democracy. First, rumors, allegations, and fabrications circulate on social media, particularly on X, whose owner, Elon Musk, seems peculiarly dedicated to aggravating ethnic conflicts in Britain. A narrative quickly coalesces around the perpetrator and the wider political causes, the excesses of immigration and liberalization, and a state and a police force that are sympathetic to everyone except white Britons. Violence follows. And if the far right becomes a feature of British politics, prominent voices are willing to abstain from condemning the violence, excuse it, or even appear to encourage. The anti-immigrant nationalist Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage, has been steadily moving from the fringes to the mainstream. With 8 lawmakers in Parliament, it consistently tops polls, with increasingly talked about as capable of winning the next general election. Mr. Farage described the reaction of our leaders to Mr. Nowak's death as proof of a tiered culture in this country, where the rights and privileges of white people matter less than those of ethnic minorities, and urged Britons to respond with pure, cold rage. A more explicitly far-right party, Restore Britain, formerly by the lawmaker Rupert Law, a breakaway from reform and endorsed by Mr. Musk, responded to Nowak's murder in a long post on X that said, "Enough is enough," and the keeping alive the savage who killed him served nobody. As Britain's traditional two-party democracy disintegrates and voters splinter in 5 or 6 directions, reform may lead the polls, but gets only around 25% support. The boundaries that once distinguished the center-right from the far-right have collapsed. Andrew Drilling writes in his book, "If we tolerate this flagrantly racist ideas and claims that have been utterly beyond the pale just over a decade ago, now circulating among conservative newspapers and politicians as they struggle to keep up with the rage ball of far-right influences. Last year, for example, an up-and-coming conservative lawmaker named Katie Lamb told the Times of London that legal residents needed to go home, leaving Britain more culturally coherent. There's a troubling sense that in Britain the only right seems to possess the momentum and theoretically to succeed this new quick-fire videographic era of politics. Being in Westminster on the street, the right, including the far right, takes the initiative and sets the global agenda, leaving those in the liberal mainstream to denounce sporadic outbursts of violence without confronting the wider political, ideological climate that encourages and condones it. Few seem willing, for example, to defend the progress made in the effort to make the police force less racist over the last 30 years, an effort the right holds responsible. The effort the right holds responsible for Mr. Nowak's death. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's ineptitude for leadership in a well-rehearsed problem. His most likely successor is Andy Burnham, the former mayor of Greater Manchester. Mr. Burnham entered Parliament last week, enabling him to mount a challenge to Mr. Starmer's leadership. But if Mr. Barr becomes Prime Minister, he will face the same problem: how to overcome the sense of inertia that has swept liberal institutions. Britain is no stranger to far-right mobilization, organized street violence. Belfast has its own distinctive history. The National Front was a visible presence in the 70s. Football hooligan was a notorious urge in the 80s and 90s. The recent United Kingdom rallies, organized by the agitator Tommy Robinson, real name Stephen Yexley Lemon, resemble the drunken, aggressive, flag-waving England football fandom, say, the Euro 2000 tournament in Belgium and the Netherlands. What's different now is the sense of the centrality of the hostility agreements is British politics, even though it's not clear at all that far-right policies have the support of anything like a majority of Britons. The ascent of the far right in Britain has been acquiring a feeling of inevitability, as it can be delayed or slowed, but never really reversed. Its opponents urgently need that own figurehead and movements if they are to demonstrate that they can do more than throw up their hands in horror. This is written by Nicholas Kristof. The war ended with a surrender. Trump's. President Trump declared in March that a deal to end the war with Iran would require unconditional surrender, but it wasn't quite right. The preliminary argument he just reached with the Iran was more likely a conditional surrender by the U.S. In the past few days, various Republicans and war hawks have emerged, seemingly bewildered to criticize the deal. Trump has surrendered to Iran, wrote Eric Erickson, a conservative commentator. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas warned, giving billions of dollars to theocratic lunatics who want to murder us is not a good idea. The criticisms are correct. The Iran deal is a major setback. It gives immediate relief to Iran, including the prompt unfreezing of billions of dollars of Iranian assets, and later a $300 billion fund to help rebuild Iran. And it appears to open the door to Iran gaining a less partial control over the Strait of Hormuz, with the ability 60 days hence to charge fees of ships transiting the strait. This is the worst policy blunder in decades, lamented Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Yet those denunciations miss the most important point. Trump's fundamental mistake was not ending the war, but getting into it in the first place. At this stage, Trump was right to retreat, for he had no good options, and continuing the war would surely have cost more lives. It was already shattering the global economy and Republicans' chances in the midterm. If we didn't do this deal, we would have dropped more bombs for another 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 years. You never have the Hormuz Strait open, Trump said. I didn't want to see economic catastrophe. The unpalatable truth is that Iran won the war, and that's why it won the negotiations. Trump dawdled as long as he could because he realized any deal he could hope reach would be a humiliation. But the failure of the war had left him with no good exit. The lesson to be learned from this debacle is to avoid starting endless wars that hurt everything, will work out perfectly, and to really rely far more on diplomacy to solve global problems. But in this case, the hawks who were most determined to destroy Iran have done the most to strengthen it, and that should be a cautionary tale. I'm sorry, listener, I have to read another article because the printing on this one is difficult to read. Musk confirms ancient concerns about the super rich. Ever since Elon Musk became the world's first trillionaire, people have been trying to grasp the scale of his incomprehensible fortune. Some have noted that a stack of $100 bills amounting to $1 trillion would extend 670 miles high. The economist Stephen Durlan observed that John D. Rockefeller was worth at one point equal about 1.5% of the U.S. gross domestic product, and that Mr. Musk's wealth now amounts to at least twice as much, at more than 3%. It may not escape New York Knicks fans that even Jalen Brunson, who makes about $39 million, would need to play more than 25,000 seasons to accomplish that kind of money. But for all the numbers I've seen, the one that struck me most was a calculation in the Times that Mr. Musk's net worth is 5 million times as large as that of the average family. As a historian of political thought, I immediately thought of Plato, the first Western philosopher who really grappled with economic inequality. In his Laws, through the character of Athenian stranger, Plato contended that in a thriving republic, if anyone acquired more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest, he should donate the surplus to the city. Not 5 million times the wealth of the typical family, 4 times the wealth of the poorest. To be sure, it's difficult to imagine how a modern economy would operate with Plato's proposed constraints on wealth acquisition, but it's not hard for a modern reader to understand the concerns that led him to his radical proposal. Let me read that proposal again. That's pretty good. Plato contended that in a thriving republic, if anyone acquired more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest, 4 times of the, he should donate the surplus to the city. Pretty interesting. For Plato, the source of inequality was a disease of the soul that the Greeks call pleonexia, kind of insatiable greed. In Plato's Gorgias, Socrates likened this condition to a leaky jug. No matter how much water one pours into it, it will demand more. For some, the desire for money extends only so far as necessary to cover their needs. In others, the desire is infinite. Plato likened those insatiable souls to slaves who are ruled by their desire. Someone consumed with unquenchable desires comes to love himself far beyond what he can feel for the rest of humanity. He was, for Plato, a poor judge of what is just, good, and noble. Because he would always treat his desires as more valuable even than the truth. As a consequence, Plato wrote, it is impossible that those who become very rich also become good. Plato's fears about insatiable greed have been vindicated by Mr. Musk, who already set his sights on 10 trillion. He has confirmed Plato's concerns about the moral failures of the super rich by characterizing empathy as the fundamental weakness of Western civilization. Huh. How about if you were somebody making $40,000 a year and listening to Musk? With the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, he put U.S. Agency for International into the wood chapter, as he gleefully put and contributed to the deaths of an estimated 600,000 people. Such carnage is a predictable outcome of a society that has chosen to place no upper limits on wealth. Plato was acutely aware that the ideal solution, such as 4-to-1, are impossible to carry out where great inequality already exists. But he did not encourage legislators and citizens to throw up their hands and surrender. Rather, he urged citizens, including the fewer rich ones with a sense of fairness, to do what they could to level society, starting by shaming those with excessive fortunes. He stressed that true poverty consists not in lessening of one's property, but an increase of one's avarice. Only by teaching the evils of extreme greed can society begin to restore the healthy balance of wealth necessary for a thriving republic. Maybe Plato's philosophy applies to Bill Gates. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, June 21st, issue of the New York Times Opinion section. We read from the New York Times Opinion section every Sunday, 2 p.m. Your reader's been Dick Shanley. Thanks for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading,